webinar is about neurodivergence and pain management. So as a service, we've created a leaflet for people to consider how neurodivergence might affect you, how it might affect your pain condition, and how it impacts on how you manage your pain. But we had some feedback that it'd be helpful to have this in kind of video format as well. So I'm going to be thinking about that today. So the aims of this webinar are about helping you to understand and reflect on how neurodivergence might be affecting you and your pain and how you manage it. So this is aimed at people who are either going to or currently are going through a pain management program at our service. And we're going to be thinking about how some of the topics that come up in the pain management program, how they might be different or how you might have to think differently about those if you're someone that has neurodivergence. So thinking about stress and trauma, how we might use relaxation and mindfulness slightly differently, and how you might adapt sleep and self-compassion strategies to suit you. We're also then going to consider how there are particular traits of neurodivergence and how these might impact on generally on pain management. So looking at interoception, executive functioning, cognitive flexibility, and communication. And this webinar really is about kind of education, exploring different ideas for you. It might not be that you come out with all the exact answers, but it's about thinking through kind of your individual needs. Okay, and just thinking about your neurodivergence now, and please kind of find ways to get through this webinar in a way that is most helpful for you. So feel free to hit pause at any point, take breaks, get up, move about. It might be helpful to have a notepad and pen to jot ideas down. You could use your pain management manual to jot some ideas down. There's some free pages at the back. And also just have a little moment to consider your current environment and whether there's anything you could do to reduce the distractions. So whether it's putting your phone in a different room, perhaps kind of just thinking about how you can reduce kind of being interrupted. So going somewhere in the house that's a bit quieter, and whether there's something that would be helpful for you to help you concentrate. So using a fidget toy or making sure you're getting up and moving around regularly during this webinar. Okay, so we're not going to go into too much detail about this because you're here because you're kind of considering either you have a diagnosis or you think you might be neurodivergent. So we're not going to go into too much detail about the definition of it. But just to highlight really that it's not a disability or a disorder. It is just a difference in the way that your brain processes information, and it's very much an umbrella term. And so this webinar is going to attempt to give ideas for people with all sorts of different ways that their brain processes information. So mostly we're focusing on autism and ADHD, but there are lots of other conditions as well. So dyslexia is very common, for example. So as I said, we're focusing on autism and ADHD, and we really what we're aiming to do is to support you to access the pain management program as best you can. So we're just thinking about how we can help you through the program. So our first topic that we bring up, and usually in that kind of first session on the pain management program, is about stress and trauma, because we know that these are a threat to the pain system. And unfortunately, there's a lot of research that shows that neurodivergent people are more likely to experience traumatic events. They're also more likely or more often perceive and experience things as traumatic that others do not. And I guess the problem is that the nervous system of neurodivergent people is more vulnerable and reactive after trauma, so making it more likely that things like post-traumatic stress disorder will develop. If that is the case for you, psychological therapy can really help with processing trauma, and you can ask us or your GP about accessing your local psychological therapy service. But really, this slide is just about acknowledging that it is more likely, unfortunately, that you've experienced traumatic events, and that your brain has found that harder to process. Your nervous system has been more vulnerable to that. So yeah, higher rates of traumatic experiences, higher prevalence of PTSD. You're more likely to develop PTSD after a traumatic experience, particularly for women as well. Okay. So there's kind of more information on that slide as well. So with autism, for example, we find that autistic people tend to have less flexible nervous systems, so it makes it more challenging to regulate after a particular stress or trauma. And ditto with stress. We know that living in a world designed for neurotypical people can result in a lot more stress and burnout for people with autism. So neurodivergent individuals are more likely to experience stress to do with a lot of factors. So there's living in a world designed for neurotypical people. You are a minority group, and so you experience minority stress like discrimination, stigma, prejudice, and that can negatively impact on mental and physical health, unfortunately, as well as kind of substance use, educational, occupational performance, social support, relationships, and all of these feed into a kind of a more stressful experience, a more stressful outcome. You might experience challenges with communication, and that's something that we'll come back to. And that makes it harder to express and have your needs met, which again is more stressful. In addition to that, it's more likely that you'll experience sensory sensitivities, so kind of sensory overload, which can be more distressing. And so all of this results in a lot more stress on your nervous system. It's that fight or flight response, or that kind of being stuck at red dog. In one of the pain management programs, we talk about this idea of just being always stuck on high alert. And unfortunately, that is more likely for neurodivergent individuals. So on the pain management program, we look at relaxation, but for lots of different reasons. There are kind of the classic relaxation exercises can actually feel distressing for people, for neurodiverse people. So things related to stillness, having to be still, things related to silence, doing nothing can actually all be quite overwhelming for people. So you might have found that you've tried relaxation exercises that either from the program or from other kind of places, and actually you've not found it relaxing at all. So what we need to explore is what works for you. So kind of thinking about relaxation in terms of anything that reduces sensory load, emotional demand, cognitive effort, or social pressure. So that might look different from other people's way of relaxing. It's about finding that kind of the right environment, the right structure that actually does help your brain to settle. So it might be that there are particular exercises or practices in the pain management program that you need to tag out of, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to kind of justify that or explain yourself in the program, and the facilitators will understand that. But have a think about what other relaxation ideas there might be for you. So we know, although unfortunately movement can cause more pain for people, we do recognize that actually that can be quite relaxing for people. So movement-based relaxation might look like walking, stretching, pacing, dancing, stimming, which is kind of any repetitive body movements, tapping for some people. So explore what kind of you find relaxing. Monotasking is another one that people report finding helpful. So that's kind of focusing on one simple repetitive activity. Tapping is an example of that. There might be kind of vocal ways that you can use relaxation. So we'll come back to that related to breathing in just a minute, but humming or singing or self-talk, people find relaxing. Thinking about kind of auditory ways of relaxing, it might be that you need ear plugs or noise cancelling headphones to kind of block out sounds. It might be that you find white noise or kind of the sound of water, or the sound of kind of, I think it's called dolphins in music, and kind of explore what kind of auditory things you find relaxing. Think about touch. So think about soft fabrics. Some people find weighted blankets helpful. They're quite Marmite, quite love-hate. People find them brilliant, or people hate them, but might be worth trying. And then fidget toys. We really, really recommend having fidget toys. Try out and explore different ones. They're normally pretty cheap, and you can have an explore of what you find relaxing or what helps you to concentrate sometimes as well. Think about kind of visual, how can you potentially reduce how much sensory overload you're experiencing? So using sunglasses, dimming the lights, it might be relaxing for you. Potentially certain tastes or certain smells, explore that. And then, yeah, people often report finding being out in nature very relaxing. So think about how you could use that, whether that's just looking at pictures of nature or whether that's going into your garden or local park. So think about kind of, yeah, what's worked from the program, what's kind of maybe needs a little bit of adaptation, and what could you add in that might be more suited to you. There is no right or wrong with this. It's just about recognizing what helps to calm your nervous system down. Okay. The next kind of strategy that's regularly talked about in the pain management program is mindfulness. And again, it might be that there are certain mindfulness exercises that feel really tricky. Often, again, it's related to kind of feeling the sort of stillness or that can kind of increase your agitation. It might be about noticing your body that can be tricky, and we'll come back to that interoception, the difficulties with that. Sometimes this idea of kind of clearing your mind can feel just impossible for you. You feel like your mind's kind of working at 100 miles an hour, so it just kind of leaves you feeling frustrated. Sometimes the idea of focusing on one thing can be tricky, and then one kind of this idea of being aware of the present moment can actually lead to sensory overload, and it can feel too intense. So we kind of want to strip back what is mindfulness and really again explore what works for you. Again, it is okay if you need to tag out of a particular exercise or practice during the program. Mindfulness is any practice that helps you notice your experience in that current moment without overwhelm. So traditional mindfulness does often clash with neurodivergent nervous systems. But what we need to be thinking about is how can we adapt it so that it does feel manageable and not overwhelming. So I've got a few ideas here, but it's not an exhaustive list. So breathing, that's kind of the first exercise that we usually introduce in the program. And what we can use, one method that some people find helpful is called sound breath awareness. So the idea is that you start by holding your hand up in front of your mouth, and you exhale onto the palm of your hand with a nice loud like a just like you might breathe hot air onto your glasses before you clean them. And then you close your mouth and you continue with that idea of that sound. So what you're doing is you're concentrating on the sound of your breath. So closing your mouth, focusing on the sound of your breath, and keep up the breathing so that you can hear the exhalation as well as the inhalation. You can close your eyes if that feels comfortable, but that is not essential. If it feels more comfortable to just keep your eyes focused on one particular area. So you're making the breaths long and smooth, but maintaining the sound so that you can hear it. And you might want your hand over your mouth to help with that, or you can put your hands down if that feels more comfortable. So listening closely with all your concentration to the sound, and it sounds a little bit like kind of an ocean tide flowing in and out. So just continue to focus all of your attention on the sound of your breath for about 5 to 10 breaths. So letting that sound be your anchor. So that's one particular way of using mindful breath in a slightly different way. Another option is to use movement when you're with your breath work. So you can put your hand on your chest and your hand on your belly. And again, focusing on the movement rather than on specifically on the breath. So kind of paying attention to your hand moving up and down. Feeling the rise and fall of your hands resting on your body. Again, you can do that for a sort of 5 to 10 breaths, just staying with that movement. So we've got focusing on the sound, we've got focusing on the movement. Another option which you may have been introduced to in the program is 5-finger breath. So you trace your hand up and down your fingers as you breathe. So breathing in and breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. in and out, in and out, in and out. So that's called 5-finger breathing. And the final one that some people find helpful, if focusing on breath is just it's just not comfortable for you. Some people find focusing on the sensation of their heartbeat quite soothing. So you could try paying attention to the place in your body where your heartbeat is felt. So again, that might be on your chest, or it might be on your neck, or possibly on your wrist. So again, the idea would be just to spend a minute or so just focusing on the sensation of that pulsing heartbeat. And some people find that quite soothing. Other kind of mindfulness ideas, obviously we've introduced the mindful movement sequence during the program. So that'll be something that people do find quite helpful. Might be that walking and mindful walking is something that works for you. So focusing on what you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell, those sorts of things while you're walking, that is mindfulness. Ditto any kind of repetitive activity where you're just focusing on it, on the movement, on the what it looks like, what it sounds like, that is mindfulness. So you can do that with mindful eating and drinking as well. So a cup of tea, start by smelling it, start by feeling the kind of warmth around the cup. What does it feel like in your mouth? All of those sorts of things, that is mindfulness. Ditto, you can do mindfulness in your morning routine. So whether it's when you're in the shower or brushing your teeth, you might find that kind of, that activity is easier than kind of the more formal exercises that we've gone through. What's really important with mindfulness is that you kind of important to remember you are not failing if you get distracted. So it's very much the nature of human brains. Mindfulness is not about staying in the present moment, but about returning to the present moment when you get distracted. And that will take practice, and nobody, maybe Buddhist monks kind of exempt from this, but nobody is able to stay in the present moment the entire time. Our minds all wander. So it's about not judging that, not having a go at yourself, just noticing it and returning to whatever the kind of mindfulness exercise is. So experiment with those things, see what you find works, what you find helpful. Another area that we talk about in the pain management program is sleep. And this can be really, really tricky for neurodivergent individuals. The kind of research shows that a predictable, calming bedtime routine is really helpful for people who are struggling with sleep. So going to bed at roughly the same time every night. What's really important with that is that we want to hold that with some flexibility. So we don't want it to become so strict that any deviation, from the routine becomes a stress in itself. Sort of staring at the clock, panicking that you haven't quite made it into bed at the exact time that you wanted to. So do kind of hold that with some flexibility. But yeah, a kind of something that's quite predictable that tells your nervous system, I'm winding down now. I'm heading towards bedtime can be really helpful. And it can just be maybe 3 or 4 steps that you take in that kind of lead up to bedtime, whether it's having a shower, getting pajamas on, brushing teeth, reading for 5 minutes or so, or listening to some quiet music before you go to bed. And in that lead up to bedtime and at bedtime, think about kind of your sensory needs. So it might be that having quite low lights in the lead up to bed is helpful. So shutting the curtains if it's in summertime, kind of a couple of hours before bed, or dimming the lights if it's the evening. Some people find in the lead up to bedtime having kind of what they called actually, I'll come back to that on the next slide. Other kind of sensory needs at bedtime might be using white noise. You can get white noise machines, or you can just use kind of something from Spotify. Using weighted blankets, as I mentioned, and have a think about whether your curtains are good enough, whether you need some further kind of blackout, or the cheapest option obviously is to wear an eye mask, and you can get some really nice ones now that sit a bit off your eyes, so kind of have a bit of a gap there, which can be more comfortable for people. And what we want to be thinking about is in that lead up to bedtime is transitioning to kind of turning your brain off. So that might be writing down tomorrow's tasks, what needs to be done tomorrow, so you can kind of get that off your mind. It might be writing things that are worrying you down, call it a worry list. And then kind of listening to familiar music, stories, podcasts, relaxation, and potentially breathing exercises. And the other kind of thing, I guess, thinking about in the lead up to bedtime is if hyperfocus is something that you struggle with, we often, not uncommon, for example, that people find it very difficult to stop gaming or a particular thing they're watching on TV. And we all know now the kind of problem with Netflix and rolling episodes. Some people find it helpful to set multiple alarms in the lead up to bedtime. So kind of it might be that only one alarm isn't sufficient to get you to stop. But using kind of more than one might be helpful. You can get fancy lighting that gradually dims throughout the evening. That would be, yeah, if you've got the tech and technology and money for that, that could be useful. But really, we're thinking about avoiding highly engaging activities late into the evening. If you know that that's something that you struggle to wind down from or struggle to stop, you need to be kind to yourself and think, actually, this might not be the time to engage in that activity. Now, we all know that people talk about screen time being tricky before bed, but we need to be realistic with it. It might be that no screens before bed just feels too difficult. So how could we kind of potentially be kinder to ourselves with that? So you might be thinking about blue light filters. So that picture there of those glasses, those are actually blue light filter glasses, and you can get them quite cheap online as well. Think about kind of lowering the brightness of your screen, whether it's your phone or laptop or something. And then potentially thinking about what am I watching and could it be less emotionally intense, less highly stimulating just before bed? So, not a high psychological thriller or, a really intense game, but kind of something calming, something a bit more helpful for winding down. And then the final thing to think about is how we can support your body's sleep signals. So, one of the things I think we talk about in the program is this idea that your sleep is actually related to your whole daytime as well. So thinking about daylight exposure, particularly as soon as you can after waking. So get those curtains open. If you can step outside, that's really, really good for your body. To kind of realize it's daytime now, and yeah, that helps with your circadian rhythm. And if you can keep, again, as well as bedtime times, keeping wake up times relatively consistent as well, can be really helpful for your circadian rhythm. Okay, moving on to I think the last topic, self-compassion. So again, the research shows that neurodivergent people often experience lower self-compassion and higher self-criticism. So I want to think about how could we make some gentle changes that kind of to be kinder to yourself and to reduce that chance of things like autistic burnout and stress. So the first thing to think about is how can you honor your needs? Whether it's going to a social occasion, you might text before and say, I need to leave early, unfortunately. And then if you've texted before, it's a lot easier to just to slip out and it not be too tricky. Or taking breaks from social occasions, popping outside, for example, if you're at the pub, having a breather. Might be kind of something to think about just generally in terms of life at the moment and lifestyle, whether there's any kind of priorities that could be reevaluated, whether there's any mental load that could be reduced. And that links very strongly to asking for help. It is not a sign of weakness to ask for help. We all need help and support. So think about how could you be kinder to yourself in that way. And think about how can you harness your neurodivergent strengths. I think we spend so long considering all of the kind of deficits, as it were, but actually there's many things that are great strengths, whether it's your creativity, your honesty, your attention to detail. And can you consider aligning some of your goals, maybe the goals that we're setting in the pain management program? How can we align them with your strengths? Give yourself a fighting chance of kind of achieving your goals. How can we kind of meet your sensory needs? So I've mentioned that a few times already, kind of whether it's noise cancelling headphones, sunglasses. Many people on the program wear sunglasses inside, and that's absolutely fine. Whether it's comfy clothes, kind of having quiet spaces to go to, or using fidget tools. Think about how you can use those in different scenarios as well. I think people often feel comfortable doing that on a pain management program, but you should feel confident to do that in any situation you need to. Um, in terms of kind of, sorry, go back to the harnessing your neurodivergent strengths, also kind of consider what are the tasks that feel less effort or more absorbing, and how can we use, that tool of pacing and having red and green tasks, how can you consider your neurodiversity in that as well? So sprinkling in those kind of tasks that feel less effort for you throughout the day. And then finally, how can you be kinder to yourself by reducing masking where it feels safe? So that might be about kind of thinking about who your people are. Can you spend time with people who accept you as you are, and that you don't have to kind of explain if you have sensory needs or adaptations? You can feel comfortable doing that. You can allow yourself to stim or to move in a way that feels comfortable for you. So that's, all about being kind to yourself and your needs, which are as valid as anybody else's. Okay, so those were some of the topics that we cover on the program and how you might adapt them a little bit to your individual needs. So just experiment with that. It might be that now you want to kind of pause the video and just jot some ideas down about some of that and things you want to try. Again, just thinking, small changes. These don't need to be big things. You don't need to kind of overhaul, particularly when it comes to sleep. We don't want mega changes all in one go. For example, if you've been going to bed at 2 a.m. and you want your bedtime to be 10 p.m., don't go straight to 10 p.m. at this point. Your body will not know that that's bedtime yet. So we need to do that gently and gradually. So from 2 a.m. is your bedtime, think about going to bed at 1:45 a.m. Do that for 5 nights or something, and then change it to 1:30 and then 1:15. So gently, slowly. Okay, so now we're going to consider how kind of certain traits of neurodivergence and how they might impact on the pain management approach. So looking at these 4 different areas here: interoception, executive functioning, cognitive flexibility, and communication. I know there's a lot of terms there that can be quite tricky to understand, so I will go through those. So the first one is interoception. So this is your awareness of your internal physical sensations. So whether that's hunger, tiredness, pain, your emotions, all of that stuff. Interoception is important because it helps you to tune into your body's signals and respond appropriately. And the tricky thing is for people, for neurodivergent people, this can be hyposensitive and it can be hypersensitive. But either way, there can be more stress related to that. So for people that struggle to recognize their internal physical sensations, that can lead to more stress and anxiety. Often things can kind of go under their radar until they're really bad. And it can mean that actually your kind of basic needs aren't being met. So you're not noticing that you're dehydrated or that you've not eaten all day, and so your energy and fatigue levels are super high. And actually, it's because your sugar levels are very low. So that's something, kind of improving interoceptive awareness is possible. And actually, quite a few of the exercises, you'll be pleased to hear, a lot of the practices that we do in the program actually do help to improve interoceptive awareness. So the body scan that we'll have introduced, breathing exercises, and progressive muscle relaxation can all help with interoceptive awareness. It might be that the way that they were done on the program felt quite difficult. So you might need to think about how you can adapt those exercises. So the first and the kind of easiest way of adapting it is to keep it short. So you don't need to do a 20-minute body scan. A couple of minutes is all it needs to be. It might be that you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes. So don't close your eyes. That's absolutely fine. And again, stillness might be something that's tricky for you. So you can think about how you do the body scan while kind of introducing some movement. So it might be just gentle rocking. It might be tapping the body part or touching the body part as you focus your attention on it. It might be that there are certain body parts that are tricky, and you have our permission to skip those if that's needed. And then thinking about breathing or the progressive muscle relaxation, we know that autistic nervous systems, they do like structure. And so having a consistent rhythm can be quite helpful. So when you do the progressive muscle relaxation, the idea is that you're kind of tensing an area and then releasing it, tensing it and releasing it. And it might be that for you, you want to count kind of 3 seconds for tension and then 5 seconds to release. Having a consistent rhythm can be quite soothing for people. And ditto with any breathing exercises, you might find that counting a breath in and then counting a breath out. So again, 3 seconds in and 5 seconds out might be soothing for you. So using that kind of rhythm. And as I mentioned earlier, it might be external cues can be helpful. So having your hand on your tummy and on your chest can be quite a helpful tip as well. So yeah, improve kind of working on, I guess, firstly, it's about just your awareness that interoception is tricky for you. So again, with things like dehydration and not eating, it might be that you need external reminders of those. So you get those great water bottles that have the kind of time of day kind of along the edge of it. That might be quite a good one. I know a few people that we've worked with have actually bought a kind of strap so that they can have their water bottle attached to them at all times, so it kind of reminds them to drink. And ditto with meal times, perhaps kind of thinking about how you can have reminders of that, whether it's having someone in the house to remind you or setting alarms. Again, I know that can feel like a very common, I'm saying that a lot, setting an alarm for everything, but or a task reminder is the other one that you can get on your phone. Okay, the second kind of area that can be tricky for people is executive functioning. So that's kind of what we call a set of mental skills that we all have to help us to plan and organize ourselves. And neurodiverse people can have what we call executive dysfunction. So tricky, kind of find these things tricky. And that can result in problems with losing things, misplacing possessions, forgetting where they are. It can be about finding it harder to concentrate, finding it difficult to think ahead, planning, difficulties learning new things, difficulties controlling emotions, rigid thinking, finding time management very hard, acting impulsively without thinking through the consequences, finding it hard to kind of pay attention to conversations and difficulties remembering details. And obviously, a lot of what we're teaching on the pain management program kind of requires quite a lot of planning and thinking and taking on new information. So that can be really tricky. So again, just some tips for this. So one thing we always suggest is just try to reduce the amount of information your brain has to hold in mind. So putting key information into physical form. That's why we kind of suggest using notebook. It might be that you have an app on your phone that you can write notes or lists on, using highlighters to kind of give that visual prompt, having reminders of tasks on your phone. Try and reduce the amount that you have to hold in mind and have to remember. Again, as I've said, kind of making time more physical, so using timers, using physical reminders. Next one, kind of managing your environment to help reduce distractions and overstimulation. So when there are times when you need to concentrate, think about how you can help yourself to do that. So whether it's using headphones, turning down the lights, putting your phone somewhere else. And with all of this, kind of be kind to yourself. You need to acknowledge that this is something that is a struggle, is tricky, and just consider how you can soothe yourself when you're finding these stressful. One thing I've not mentioned on there, but this kind of a big one, is asking for help. So please do be kind to yourself with all of these. Okay, cognitive flexibility is the next one that kind of people, neurodivergent people can find quite tricky. So as part of the pain management approach, we are asking people to think differently about their pain and change the way that they manage it. And that requires flexible thinking. So this is an aspect of executive functioning, this idea I've just mentioned, that people with neurodivergent individuals do find difficult. So when we have inflexible thinking, that might be rigid thinking. It might be black and white thinking. So it's either this or it's that, and there's kind of no shades of grey in between. Either I've achieved something or I haven't. For example, it might be intolerance of uncertainty. So sometimes people find it very difficult to try things out, to get started, kind of for that fear of what might happen and not knowing what might happen can be really difficult for people. And it might be that you just find sameness quite soothing, and it's really hard to move away from that. And rigid thinking can make it more challenging to see different perspectives, to consider alternative options, to kind of change plans, be open to change. And unfortunately, all of those are really helpful strategies for when considering pain management. So the hope is that just kind of by simply being aware of that, it will increase your self-compassion if you're finding it difficult to make changes to how you manage your pain. So, if you're finding these things really hard, be kind to yourself about it. It's not your fault that you're finding these things tricky. It's how your brain is wired, and that is not your fault. But we do have a few little tips for this. So you can improve flexible thinking skills with practice. And the best way to increase flexibility is to build opportunities to practice, as with anything, practice, practice, practice. So just trying kind of natural times throughout the day that you could consider trying out some flexibility. So if you have a very specific daily routine that you stick to, try making just one small change to it. It might be the order in which you do things, or just one small thing that you could change. It might be just trying out a new experience, a new activity, or a new food that doesn't feel too overwhelming for you. You could take a task that you always do in the same way and try doing it slightly differently. Try a different route when you're walking somewhere or driving somewhere. Try sitting in a new spot. We always find it funny in the pain management program that people do tend to sit in the same place every week. You could try sitting in a new place. And try and think about two different solutions to one problem, just to kind of brainstorm the possibility that there are different ways to tackle something. When you're kind of going through this practice, do you try and consider kind of why or how flexibility might be useful for you in managing pain? So, if it's something, I'm trying to think examples, if it's something that you're struggling with to pace, whether it's hoovering the house, a really good one, people can find that really tricky to chunk kind of to take that into small steps. So people will say, I have to hoover the whole house in one go, and find it very tricky to stop halfway through that. But introducing cognitive flexibility in that, could you try out just hoovering one room and stopping, or hoovering the ground floor and stopping, whatever what might feel like a kind of easier first step. So think about when you're testing out this cognitive flexibility, can you test it out in relation to managing pain? And yeah, a lot of this often relates to pacing and how we go about pacing our activities. Now, with intolerance of uncertainty, we would recommend working on that with kind of very gradual exposure to uncertain situations. So taking a really gentle approach to that, managing any anxiety that shows up with that exposure. So it is likely that some anxiety will show. So you could have someone with you to support you through that if it's a new place, for example. And remember, we're looking at kind of small changes. We want to be really kind to your nervous system. We don't want to kind of create more stress. You might have already done this exercise in a pain management program, but if you have a go at just crossing your arms, my camera's not very helpful because you can't really see my arms, but okay. And now don't do it. Now try turning them the other way. You kind of just notice what that feels like. So you have this automatic kind of habitual way of crossing your arms that just comes without thinking about it. And switching to that non-habitual way requires your brain to kind of override that default pattern. And most people find that feels a bit funny, feels awkward, it feels wrong, almost kind of wrong when folding your arms in the opposite way. And that discomfort kind of mirrors what cognitive inflexibility can feel like. And when you start to try and make those changes, it can feel a bit funny, feel a bit awkward. Um, and if it's happening with something as simple and kind of unthreatening as arm folding, you do have to be kind to yourself and expect a little bit of that awkward feeling. So do keep these kind of changes to manageable levels, but just holding in mind that kind of long-term goal of pain management, of managing your pain better, um, when you're making these changes. Okay, the final area I wanted to look at was communication. Um, So we know that communication is super important in managing chronic pain, but it can be really tricky for neurodivergent people, because how you communicate often differs from neurotypicals. So the research shows that kind of autistic to autistic communication works very well, but neurodivergent to neurotypical communication you can get kind of mismatches. So bearing in mind, communication is a shared responsibility. So what we want to think about is kind of, are there conversations that you could have with friends and family if there are clashes in communication and kind of regular misunderstandings, for example? So how could you and they adjust communication styles to meet your needs? Um, so kind of some examples of adjustment. Um, say what you mean, and it might be that you need to ask people to say exactly what they mean. You can explain, I find ambiguity really tricky to get my head around. I need you to tell me exactly what you mean. Um, you might be asking people to kind of break things into smaller pieces, to kind of help with your with processing. Um, you might ask people to allow time, allow silence, allow kind of a moment to process what's being said. What can be really helpful is if you're asking questions to clarify your understanding and encouraging them to do the same things to sort of catch misunderstandings at the early stages. So clarifying things, checking that you've understood right. That's a tip that we often advise in medical appointments in particular. At the end, you say, can I just check I've understood this right? You're saying to me, wait for 2 weeks, and if symptoms haven't improved, get back in touch, or whatever it might be. You say, can I just check this is the plan? Um, and it might be that we need to think about changing the format. So one of the reasons we've run this webinar is to help people who find having just a written leaflet more tricky. They find listening easier and vice versa. So thinking about, actually, is there a way that you would prefer communication, whether it's written down, or texting someone? Would you find that easier? Sending voice notes, would you find that easier as a way of communicating with someone? Other thoughts, kind of asking if you need more time to process. So I know one particular participant we had said that they explained to their friends that they would always take a day to respond to invitations, to give them time to process it and to think about it. So that's a very reasonable request. You could explain that to people, sorry. So think about, where is communication clashing at the moment, and does some of that relate to neurodiversity, and how could you kind of work on that or adapt it? A lot of this might be about explaining to people how your communication style is different. Sometimes I'm more blunt, it doesn't mean I'm rude. There's kind of simple explanations, just helping people to get to know you better and vice versa. So I hope you found the webinar helpful as a kind of introduction, or a sort of a little bit of information about how we might consider adapting the pain management program for you. This was a very brief talk, and it's a very big topic, so there's lots of information out there, and these are some helpful resources for that. That I'll give you a second just to have a look at, or you can pause the video if you want to write any of those ideas down. Any questions or any kind of feedback about this webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at COPE. But I hope that you found it useful. Okay.